A man stands over a kill he didn't make. His hunting partner is 20 feet away, gutting the animal they actually caught together. And yet this man is already rehearsing the story he'll tell back at camp. None of it happened the way he's about to say it happened. But by the time the fire is lit that night, his version is the only one anyone remembers, because he tells it with more conviction than the truth ever had. This is not a modern habit picked up from politics or social media. This is something close to 50,000 years old, and it may be one of the most underrated turning points in the entire story of how our species got this far. Lying feels like a flaw, something we apologize for, something we punish children for doing. But evolution doesn't keep traits around for 50,000 years out of sentimentality. If deception had been purely destructive, purely parasitic on human cooperation, natural selection would have stamped it out the same way it eliminates any trait that consistently gets an organism killed before it can reproduce. Instead, lying didn't just survive across every human culture ever studied. It appears to have shown up at almost exactly the same time our ancestors started living in larger, more complicated social groups. That timing is not a coincidence, and once you understand why, the entire act of telling a lie starts to look less like a moral failure and more like a strange kind of social technology. To understand where human lying came from, it helps to look at deception outside our own species first, because dishonesty did not begin with us. A fork-tailed drongo, a small African bird, has learned to mimic the alarm calls of other species, purely to trick them into dropping their food so the drongo can steal it. Cuttlefish can display one pattern on the side of their body, facing a rival male, and a completely different, more feminine-looking pattern on the side facing a female nearby, essentially running two conflicting visual lies on two different audiences at the same exact moment. Vervet monkeys have been observed giving false alarm calls, warning of a predator that isn't actually there, just to scatter their group and grab the best food for themselves in the confusion. None of these animals are lying the way humans lie, though, and that distinction matters enormously to this story. What separates animal deception from human lying is something psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that another creature has its own separate set of beliefs, and that those beliefs can be different from reality and can be deliberately shaped. A drongo doesn't understand that another bird believes something false. It has simply been rewarded by evolution for an instinctive trick that happens to work. A human telling a hunting story, by contrast, is doing something far more complex. He has to model what his friends already believe, predict what they're likely to believe next, track whether his story is internally consistent, and adjust it in real time based on their reactions. That requires a theory of mind sophisticated enough to treat other people's minds as separate, manipulable systems. And as far as researchers can tell, that level of social cognition is something only a small number of species even approach, with humans operating in a different league entirely. This is where the story gets interesting, because theory of mind doesn't develop in a vacuum. It develops because social life demands it, and the social life of early humans was getting dramatically more complicated. Anthropologists studying primate brain sizes noticed something strange a few decades ago. Across species, the size of the neocortex, the part of the brain responsible for higher reasoning, correlated far more strongly with group size than it did with diet, habitat, or almost anything else researchers tested. This became known as the social brain hypothesis, and the core idea is simple but unsettling. Bigger brains didn't evolve mainly to help us solve physical problems like finding food or building tools. They evolved to help us navigate other people, tracking who is trustworthy, who owes who a favor, who is sleeping with whose partner, and who might be quietly plotting against the group is a genuinely massive cognitive task. And the more individuals in your social circle, the harder that task becomes. Once groups crossed a certain size, something else became inevitable. It was no longer possible to physically dominate every rival or outmuscle every threat to your status. A man who couldn't win a fight against the strongest hunter in the group still needed a way to compete for resources, mates, and influence. And that's exactly the kind of pressure that favors social maneuvering over brute force. Researchers call this the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, named after the Renaissance writer famous for cold, calculated political strategy. And it proposes that primate intelligence, including human intelligence, was shaped heavily by the advantage of being able to manipulate, persuade, and yes, deceive other members of your own species. In a small group of 5 or 6 individuals you've known your entire life, lying barely pays off because everyone already knows everything about everyone. In a group of 50, 80, or more, with shifting alliances and limited information, a well-placed lie can change your entire position in the hierarchy. Language is the piece that turned this potential for deception into something far more powerful. Because before humans could speak in complex sentences, lying was limited to actions. Hiding food, faking an injury, sneaking away unnoticed. The moment language became sophisticated enough to describe events that weren't currently happening, it also became sophisticated enough to describe events that never happened at all. Some researchers, including the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, have argued that language itself may have evolved less for sharing practical survival information and more for something closer to gossip, tracking reputations, alliances, and betrayals across a social network too large to monitor through direct observation alone. If that theory holds, then lying isn't some corruption that crept into language after the fact. It's possible that the very capacity for complex storytelling and the capacity for deception emerged from the exact same evolutionary pressure, arriving as a single package rather than 2 separate inventions. The way lying shows up in human child development backs up just how deeply wired this behavior really is. Psychologists who study early childhood have found that most children begin telling their first deliberate lies somewhere between 2 and 4 years old. And contrary to what a lot of parents assume, the children who lie earlier and more convincingly tend to score higher, not lower. On cognitive tests, a 2-year-old hiding a broken toy behind their back isn't displaying a character flaw. They're demonstrating an early, fragile version of the same mental machinery that lets adults track complicated social situations. Lying, in other words, isn't a corruption of a child's moral development. It's a milestone in their cognitive development, arriving at almost the exact same time a child starts understanding that other people can hold beliefs that are different from what's actually true. This connection between intelligence and deception holds up disturbingly well in adults, too. Researchers running deception studies in controlled lab settings have repeatedly found that telling a convincing lie is mentally harder than telling the truth. Brain imaging studies have shown increased activity in the prefrontal cortex during deception compared to truth-telling, the same region responsible for planning, impulse control, and weighing long-term consequences. This is part of why young children and people with certain types of brain damage to the prefrontal cortex often struggle to lie effectively, even when they want to. The equipment required to pull it off convincingly is some of the most advanced machinery the human brain has. None of this means every lie carries the same evolutionary weight, and it's worth being honest about the difference between the lies that likely shaped our species and the lies that just make daily life less painful. Evolutionary psychologists generally split deception into rough categories: self-serving lies that boost your own status or resources, like the exaggerated hunting story; protective lies that shield someone else from harm, like telling a sick relative they look better than they do; and the enormous, often overlooked category of social lubricant lies. The small, low-stakes dishonesty that keeps daily cooperation running smoothly, like telling a friend you love their cooking when you don't, or telling a coworker their idea is interesting before gently steering the conversation elsewhere. Studies asking people to log every lie they told over the course of a week consistently find that most adults lie multiple times a day, and the overwhelming majority of those lies are this third category, not malicious manipulation, but small social maintenance. That third category might actually be the most important one for understanding why lying became permanent rather than fading out once societies became more honest and cooperative on the whole. A group that punished every single lie with total severity, no matter how small, would also be punishing the tiny diplomatic untruths that prevent constant unnecessary conflict. Groups that tolerated low-stakes deception while still punishing high-stakes betrayal appear to have functioned more smoothly than groups demanding absolute honesty in every interaction. In this light, the human tolerance for small lies isn't a moral blind spot. It's a feature that got selected for because total, brutal honesty in every micro-interaction is actually a worse strategy for group cohesion than most people assume. What's especially striking is how consistent this pattern is across cultures, with no historical contact with one another. Anthropologists studying isolated hunter-gatherer societies, agricultural communities, and modern industrialized nations all find evidence of self-serving lies, protective lies, and social lubricant lies present in some form, even though the specific social rules about which lies are acceptable vary enormously. Some cultures place extremely high value on never lying to an elder while tolerating significant exaggeration among peers. Others treat lying to an outsider as completely different, almost expected, compared to lying to a member of your own group. The specific rulebook for acceptable lying is culturally constructed and differs everywhere you look, but the underlying behavior, the capacity and tendency to deceive under the right circumstances, shows up everywhere humans have ever been studied, suggesting it isn't a cultural invention layered on top of human nature. It looks much more like a baseline feature of human nature that culture then tries, with mixed success, to regulate. If deception was such a powerful evolutionary tool, an obvious question follows. Why didn't it spiral out of control, with every individual lying constantly until cooperation collapsed entirely? The answer seems to be that lie detection evolved as a kind of evolutionary arms race, running directly alongside the evolution of lying itself. Humans are remarkably good, though far from perfect, at picking up on inconsistencies in a story, subtle shifts in body language, and the discomfort that often accompanies deception. A population where everyone lied constantly and nobody could detect it would eventually become a population where trust collapsed and cooperation became impossible. What we ended up with instead is something closer to an equilibrium, enough deception to provide a competitive edge in specific situations, balanced by enough detection and social punishment to keep most relationships functional. This balance shows up clearly in how severely different societies punish lying, depending on what's actually at stake. Lying about something with almost no consequence, like mildly inflating a story for entertainment, is treated as harmless or even charming in most cultures. The foundation of every tall tale and exaggerated fishing story ever told around a fire. Lying that damages trust within a tightly bonded group, about fidelity, about resource sharing, about loyalty during conflict, tends to be punished severely across nearly every society on record, sometimes through exile, sometimes through violence, sometimes through permanent loss of status. The severity of the punishment seems to track almost perfectly with how much that specific lie threatens group cohesion, which is exactly what you'd expect. If lying and the social rules around it evolved together, there's also a darker thread running through this story that's worth sitting with honestly, rather than glossing over. The same cognitive tools that let humans build trust, cooperation, and eventually civilizations on a massive scale are the exact tools that allow some individuals to manipulate, exploit, and harm others on a massive scale too. Sociopathy and certain forms of antisocial personality traits are associated with above-average skill at deception, combined with a reduced response to the social and emotional costs that usually keep most people's lying in check. In a strange way, this suggests that human society runs a constant background tension between cooperative deception, the small lies that smooth social friction, and predatory deception, the lies that exploit trust for one person's gain at serious cost to everyone else. Every human community that has ever existed has had to develop some system, whether through gossip, reputation, formal law, or religious belief, to keep that second category in check. Religious and cultural taboos against lying, found in nearly every major belief system in recorded history, start to look different once you consider them through this lens. Commandments against bearing false witness, codes of honor built around never breaking your word, entire legal systems built on swearing oaths under penalty of severe punishment. All of it can be read as humanity's long-running attempt to put guardrails around an instinct that was useful in small doses and dangerous in large ones. We didn't invent lying and then invent rules to ban it as an afterthought. We evolved both the capacity to deceive and the cultural machinery to limit it, almost certainly because neither one works without the other. Modern life has changed the scale of this ancient behavior more than it has changed the behavior itself. The hunting story exaggerated around a campfire to a handful of listeners has been replaced by an exaggerated resume read by a hiring manager, a curated social media post seen by thousands, or a political claim broadcast to millions. But the underlying psychological mechanism, status enhancement through selective and creative storytelling, is remarkably unchanged from what it likely was 50,000 years ago. What has changed is the stakes and the reach. A lie that once might have cost someone their reputation within a band of 40 people can now shape elections, move financial markets, or destroy a stranger's life from thousands of miles away. And our evolved lie detection instincts, finely tuned for face-to-face interaction within small groups, are not particularly well equipped to handle deception delivered through a screen by someone we will never meet. Standing back from all of it, the uncomfortable truth is that lying isn't really the opposite of human cooperation, even though it feels that way every time someone lies to us personally. It looks far more like one of the tools that made large-scale human cooperation possible in the first place, alongside language, gossip, reputation, and the immense social brainpower required to track relationships across dozens or hundreds of people at once. The same mental architecture that allows a human being to lie convincingly is the architecture that allows that same human being to feel empathy, predict another person's needs before they're spoken, and build the kind of deep trust that makes lifelong friendship and loyalty possible in the first place. Deception and connection, it turns out, may have grown from exactly the same evolutionary root, which is either the most cynical or the most strangely hopeful way to think about why human beings have never quite managed to stop lying to each other.